The first Italian soldier fell at 320 yards, dropping face first into North African dust before the crack of a rifle shot even reached his squad mates. The second fell 4 seconds later, crumpling mid-stride as he tried to reach cover that didn't exist. By the time the third man went down with a bullet through his chest, the advancing Italian platoon had realized they were walking into a carefully prepared kill zone held by someone who had no intention of retreating and every intention of making them pay in blood for every yard they advanced. The date was February 18, 1943, and Private First Class Samuel Garrett, alone on a rocky hillside in Tunisia with nothing but his personal Winchester rifle and a resolve born of desperation, was about to prove that sometimes the most important factor in combat isn't numbers or firepower, but positioning, discipline, and the willingness to stand when everyone else is run. Tunisia in early 1943 was where the North African campaign reached its decisive phase. The British Eighth Army under Montgomery was pushing west from Libya after their victory at El Alamein. American forces, blooded but inexperienced after their rough introduction to combat at Kasserine Pass, were holding defensive positions in central Tunisia. German and Italian forces, caught between two Allied armies and running short on supplies as Allied naval and air power strangled their logistics, were fighting with the desperate competence of men who knew the African war was lost, but who had no choice except to delay the inevitable as long as possible. The terrain was unforgiving. Rocky hills that offered excellent defensive positions but limited water, valleys that funneled movement into predictable corridors, and distances so vast that mechanized forces had enormous advantages while infantry struggled simply to move from position to position under a sun that turned metal too hot to touch and turned physical exertion into dangerous exhaustion. Samuel Garrett was 26 years old and had been in the Army for 14 months, though he'd been a soldier in the practical sense for far less time than that. He was from Montana, the son of a rancher who'd taught him to shoot almost as soon as he could hold a rifle, and he'd grown up in country where distances were measured in miles and where being able to hit what you aimed at wasn't a sport but a necessity. Coyotes threatening livestock at 400 yards. Elk on distant ridge lines during hunting season. That meant the difference between meat for winter or going without. By the time Samuel was 18, he could read wind by watching grass movement, estimate range by comparing apparent size to known dimensions, and place a bullet within a hand's width of where he intended at distances that made other hunters shake their heads in respectful disbelief. His rifle, a Winchester Model 70 in .30-06 Springfield that his father had given him on his 16th birthday, was as familiar to him as his own hands, a precision instrument that he'd fired thousands upon thousands of times until the relationship between sight picture, trigger press, and bullet impact was so deeply internalized it approached instinct. When Samuel enlisted after Pearl Harbor, the Army issued him a Springfield M1903 rifle, a solid bolt-action weapon that was standard for American infantry before the M1 Garand became widely available. Samuel qualified expert with it easily, but he recognized immediately that it wasn't as accurate or as well-fitted as his Winchester. The trigger was heavier, the barrel harmonics were different, and the sights weren't as precise. For standard infantry work at ranges under 300 yards, these differences were negligible. For the kind of precision shooting Samuel had grown up doing, they mattered enormously. So when his unit, a company of the 34th Infantry Division, shipped to North Africa in January 1943, Samuel brought his Winchester with him. Packed carefully in his duffel with 100 rounds of hand-loaded ammunition he prepared before shipping out. He'd asked his company commander, a captain from Ohio who'd been a high school teacher before the war, if carrying a personal weapon was permitted. The captain, who was pragmatic enough to care more about results than regulations, said that if Samuel could shoot better with his own rifle, and if he could keep it maintained in field conditions, then he should carry whatever weapon made him most effective. The tactical situation that left Samuel alone on a hillside in central Tunisia developed through a combination of bad intelligence, worse timing, and the kind of confusion that characterized much of the early American experience in North Africa. His platoon had been ordered to establish an observation post on a hill that overlooked a road junction the division needed to monitor for enemy movement. The mission was supposed to be routine: occupy the position during daylight, observe and report any enemy activity, withdraw at dusk before enemy forces could locate and attack the position. But the intelligence that said the area was lightly patrolled turned out to be catastrophically wrong. An Italian battalion was operating in the sector, reinforced with German advisors, and equipped with better training and morale than American intelligence had estimated. Contact came in mid-afternoon when Samuel's platoon was on a hillside, spread out in defensive positions, scanning the valley below through binoculars and tried to stay alert despite heat that made thinking difficult and made the simple act of staying hydrated a constant struggle. The Italian attack came from an unexpected direction, emerging from dead ground that the American platoon hadn't adequately reconnoitered because they'd assumed their flanks were secure. Machine gun fire raked the hillside, killing the platoon's sergeant and 2 riflemen in the opening burst. Mortar rounds began falling with unnerving accuracy, suggesting that Italian observers had located the American positions before the attack began and had pre-registered fire missions. In the chaos that followed, the platoon lieutenant, a 22-year-old fresh from officer candidate school who'd never been under fire before, made a decision that was probably sensible given the circumstances, but that left Samuel in an impossible position. The lieutenant ordered a withdrawal to a secondary position a mile to the rear, where platoon could link up with company headquarters and get artillery support. The withdrawal was supposed to be covered by a base of fire element that would stay behind temporarily to suppress the Italian advance, and then displace rearward once the rest of the platoon had reached safety. Samuel was designated as part of that base of fire element, along with 3 other riflemen and a bar gunner. The withdrawal became a rout almost immediately. The Italians, sensing that the Americans were breaking, increased the tempo of their assault. More mortar rounds fell, more machine gun fire swept the hillside, and men who'd been trying to execute a disciplined withdrawal started running for their lives. The base of fire element, which was supposed to stay in position for perhaps 5 minutes, found itself isolated far longer than planned as the Italian assault continued to build. The bar gunner was killed by mortar fire. 1 rifleman was hit and had to be dragged to the rear by the other 2, leaving Samuel alone in a position that was supposed to have been occupied by 5 men. He watched the rest of his platoon disappear over the crest of the hill, moving toward what he hoped was safety. And then he turned his attention to the Italians advancing up the slope toward him and made a decision that was part calculation and part instinct. He wasn't going to run. The position he occupied, a cluster of large rocks that provided excellent cover and clear fields of fire down the slope, was too valuable to abandon. If he withdrew, the Italians would occupy the high ground and use it to observe American positions and direct fire against American forces throughout the sector. If he stayed, and if he could make the Italians pay dearly enough for advancing, he might delay their attack long enough for American forces to organize a proper defense or counterattack. Samuel had approximately 200 rounds of ammunition, 100 rounds of his hand-loaded .30-06 for the Winchester, and another 100 rounds of standard military ammunition that would also chamber in his rifle, though with slightly different ballistics. He had his canteen, mostly full. He had reasonable cover from direct fire and decent concealment from observation. He had clear sight lines down the slope for at least 400 yards in multiple directions, and he had skills honed over a lifetime of shooting at distance in terrain not dissimilar to this North African hillside. What he didn't have was support, communication with friendly forces, or any realistic prospect of survival if the Italians committed seriously to overrunning his position. But survival had become a secondary concern the moment he decided to stay. The primary concern was how many Italians he could kill before they killed him, and whether that number would be enough to matter tactically. The Italians came cautiously at first, a reinforced platoon advancing in a tactical formation that showed training and discipline. They were moving uphill toward what they probably assumed was an abandoned American position, advancing by bounds with covering fire from machine guns positioned at the base of the slope. Samuel let them close to 350 yards, wanted to be absolutely certain of his range estimation, and wanted his first shots to have maximum psychological impact. He positioned himself behind a large rock that provided solid cover for his body, while leaving a small gap at the top where he could rest his rifle on a stable surface. His shooting position was nearly perfect, stable, supported, with minimal exposure. He controlled his breathing, settled the crosshairs of the scope on the center mass of the lead Italian soldier, accounted for a slight breeze he could feel on his face, and pressed the trigger. The Winchester recoiled smoothly, and 350 yards downslope the Italian soldier dropped instantly. Samuel worked the bolt, chambered another round, shifted his point of aim to a second target, and fired again. Another hit. The Italian formation, suddenly aware that the position they were advancing toward was very much occupied and very much lethal, scattered for cover. What followed was a methodical, brutal engagement that lasted nearly 3 hours, and that would have seemed impossible if someone had described it beforehand. Samuel fired with extraordinary discipline, never rushing his shots, never wasting ammunition on targets he wasn't confident of hitting. Each time an Italian soldier exposed himself attempting to advance or attempting to locate Samuel's position, Samuel engaged with careful precision. The Winchester functioned flawlessly despite the heat and dust. The hand-loaded ammunition performed exactly as Samuel had designed it to, with consistent accuracy and ballistics. His shooting position behind the rocks remained concealed well enough that Italian return fire was largely ineffective, striking rock surfaces yards away from where Samuel actually was, or passing overhead in futile attempts to suppress a position the Italians couldn't accurately locate. The Italian company commander, frustrated by the stalled advance and by casualties that were mounting every time his men tried to move forward, called in mortar fire on the suspected American position. Several rounds landed close enough that Samuel felt a concussion and was showered with rock fragments, but the heavy boulders protecting him absorbed the blast effects and he remained unhurt. After perhaps 45 minutes of engagement, the Italians attempted a flanking maneuver, sending a squad-sized element along the slope to approach Samuel's position from the side, where they hoped to find an angle that wouldn't expose him to his direct fire. Samuel saw the movement developing early, recognized what it meant, and repositioned himself to a secondary firing position among the rocks that gave him a clear view of the route the flanking force would have to traverse. When the Italian squad emerged into the section of slope where Samuel could engage them, he fired with the same careful precision he'd been using throughout the engagement. The first man went down. The second man went down. The third man tried to retreat and went down attempting it. The remaining members of the flanking force broke and scrambled back to cover, and the flanking attempt failed completely. Samuel shifted back to his primary position and resumed engaging targets in the main Italian force, which had used a flanking attempt as cover for another push up the main slope, and which now found themselves pinned down again by fire from a position they still couldn't effectively suppress. The psychological effect on the Italian forces was significant and cumulative. They were taking casualties from a single rifleman they couldn't see clearly, couldn't locate precisely, and couldn't suppress despite sustained fire from multiple machine guns and mortars. Every attempt to advance resulted in men being shot with uncanny accuracy. The Americans had supposedly withdrawn from this hill, yet here was clear evidence that at least one American had stayed behind and was killing Italians with mechanical efficiency. After approximately 90 minutes of engagement, Italian officers could be heard shouting orders, try to rally their men for another assault. But the enthusiasm for advancing up that hill had evaporated. Soldiers who'd been willing to move forward at the beginning of the engagement now refused to leave cover, having watched too many of their comrades get shot the moment they exposed themselves. Samuel, for his part, had entered a state of focused concentration that blocked out everything except the immediate tactical problem in front of him. He wasn't thinking about survival or about the strategic situation, or about anything beyond the next shot. Identify target, estimate range, account for wind, settle the crosshairs, control breathing, press trigger, work bolt, chamber next round. Repeat. His shoulder ached from the Winchester's recoil. His hands were scraped and bleeding from handling the hot metal of the rifle and from bracing against rocks. His water was gone, canteen empty, and his mouth was so dry he could barely swallow. But none of that mattered because stopping wasn't an option. As long as the Italians kept trying to advance, he would keep shooting, and as long as he kept shooting, they weren't advancing. Around the 2-hour mark, the nature of the engagement shifted. The Italians stopped attempting to advance, and instead established firing positions at the base of the slope, apparently settling in to contain Samuel's position rather than overrun it. This was tactically sensible from their perspective. They had taken substantial casualties attempting to assault a well-defended position, and containing it while calling for reinforcements or heavier weapons was a more prudent approach than continuing to lose men in frontal attacks. For Samuel, this shift meant both relief and new danger. Relief because he was no longer being actively assaulted. danger because if the Italians brought up artillery or called in air support, his rocky position would become a death trap. He used a relative lull to reload magazines, to assess his ammunition situation, and to scan the surrounding terrain for possible withdrawal routes if withdrawal became necessary. He'd fired approximately 80 rounds, which meant he had about 120 remaining. His hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline and dehydration. He could hear Italian voices from a position below, shouting back and forth, and he could hear vehicle engines in the distance, which likely meant reinforcements or heavy weapons being brought forward. Then, unexpectedly, American artillery began falling on Italian positions at the base of the hill. Someone, somewhere, had called for fire support, and that someone had either observed the Italian concentration or had received reports of the engagement. The artillery was devastating in its effectiveness, high explosive rounds impacting directly on Italian positions with precision that suggested for observers who could see the target clearly. The Italian force, already demoralized by their failed attempts to overrun Samuel's position and by the casualties they had sustained, broke under the artillery fire. Samuel watched through a scope as Italian soldiers abandoned their positions and retreated down the slope and back toward their own lines, some carrying wounded, others simply running for their lives. He fired at retreating targets until they moved out of effective range, not from cruelty, but from tactical necessity. Every Italian soldier who made it back to friendly lines was a soldier who might fight another day against other American units. When the artillery fire lifted and the slope below was empty of living enemy soldiers, Samuel remained in position for another 20 minutes, scanning for movement, watching for any sign that the Italians might return. When he was satisfied that the engagement was truly over, he finally allowed himself to relax slightly, and the moment he did, the accumulated physical and psychological strain hit him like a physical force. His hands began shaking uncontrollably, his vision blurred. He vomited from a combination of dehydration, adrenaline crash, and delayed shock. He sat behind his rock with his back against sun-heated stone and tried to process what had just happened, but his mind felt strange and distant, as though he were observing himself from outside his own body. American forces reached his position perhaps 30 minutes later, a platoon from another company advancing cautiously up the hill, calling out to identify themselves and asking if anyone was still alive up here. Samuel called back weakly, and within minutes he was surrounded by soldiers who stared at him with expressions ranging from disbelief to something approaching awe. A lieutenant asked if he was the only one who'd stayed behind, and Samuel confirmed that yes, the others had withdrawn or been killed or wounded. The lieutenant asked how many Italians Samuel thought he'd engaged, and Samuel said honestly that he didn't know, that there'd been a lot of them, that he just kept shooting until they stopped coming. A sergeant who'd been examining the slope below through binoculars reported that he could count at least 24 Italian bodies visible on the hillside, and that based on the blood trails and the evidence of wounded being carried away, the actual casualty count was likely much higher. Over the following hours, as American forces secured the area and conducted battlefield assessment, the full scope of what Samuel had accomplished became clear. The Italian force that had attacked the hill was a reinforced company, between 80 and 100 men. Samuel alone had killed at least 33 Italian soldiers with confirmed hits, a number established by counting bodies that were later recovered from the slope. He'd wounded perhaps another 20 or 30 based on blood evidence and reports from Italian prisoners captured later. His shooting had stopped an Italian assault that would have overrun the American observation posts and likely would have led to Italian occupation of tactically significant high ground. The 3-hour engagement had delayed Italian operations in that sector long enough for American forces to reposition and establish stronger defensive lines. And Samuel had done all of this alone. With nothing but a civilian hunting rifle and ammunition, he'd loaded himself in Montana before deploying overseas. The company commander who arrived at the hill later that evening walked the position with Samuel, examined the field of fire, looked at the pile of empty brass casings from Samuel's Winchester, and asked Samuel to explain his tactical decisions. Samuel, exhausted and still somewhat in shock, explained as clearly as he could: good position, clear sight lines, fire discipline, choosing targets carefully. The captain listened, asked a few clarifying questions about Samuel's shooting technique and his ammunition, and then told Samuel he was being recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. Samuel's response was to ask if anyone had water, because his canteen had been empty for hours and he'd never been so thirsty in his life. The Distinguished Service Cross recommendation was approved, making Samuel one of the most decorated privates in the 34th Infantry Division. He continued to serve through the remainder of the Tunisia campaign and then through the invasion of Italy, fighting at Salerno and Monte Cassino. He survived the war, though he was wounded twice more and accumulated enough combat time to be rotated back to the States in early 1945. He returned to Montana, took over his father's ranch, and lived quietly for the next 40 years. He kept the Winchester, though he rarely fired it after the war, and he never spoke much about Tunisia or the hillside or the 3 hours when he'd held off an Italian company alone. When asked about the war by younger relatives or by historians researching the North African campaign in later decades, Samuel's responses were brief and factual, offering tactical details but little emotional content. The war had happened. He'd done what was necessary. He'd survived. That was the extent of what he was willing to discuss. The tactical lessons from Samuel's stand on the Tunisian hillside were studied and incorporated into infantry doctrine, particularly regarding the importance of defensive positioning and the force multiplication effect of accurate long-range fire. The fact that Samuel had used a civilian hunting rifle rather than military-issue equipment raised interesting questions about the relationship between standardization and effectiveness. Military planners valued standardization for good reasons: simplified logistics, interchangeable parts, predictable performance across diverse conditions. But Samuel's Winchester, custom-fitted to his dimensions and loaded with ammunition tailored to that specific rifle, was demonstrably more effective in his hands than a standard-issue military rifle would have been. This suggested that in certain specialized roles, particularly designated marksmen or sharpshooters, individual customization might provide tactical advantages that outweighed the logistical costs. The U.S. military, to its credit, recognized this principle and began developing programs to equip selected soldiers with specialized rifles and training, though these programs came too late to affect World War II significantly. The psychological dimension of Samuel's story reveals something important about fear and performance under extreme stress. Samuel was terrified throughout the engagement. He acknowledged this later when pressed by a military psychologist who was studying combat stress reactions. But his fear manifested as heightened focus rather than paralysis or panic, channeling his terror into the mechanical process of shooting. This wasn't courage in the sense of fearlessness. It was courage in the sense of continuing to function effectively despite overwhelming fear. The difference is crucial. Military training aims not to eliminate fear, but to ensure that soldiers can perform their duties while afraid. Samuel's lifetime of shooting experience had created behavioral patterns so deeply ingrained that they operated automatically even when his conscious mind was screaming at him to run. This is the ultimate goal of military training: to build responses that persist when conscious decision-making is compromised by stress. The broader context of the North African campaign helps explain why individual actions like Samuel's mattered so significantly. In early 1943, American forces were still learning how to fight effectively against experienced Axis forces. The defeat at Kasserine Pass had revealed serious deficiencies in American training, leadership, and doctrine. Morale was fragile, confidence was low, and every tactical success mattered enormously for rebuilding the institutional belief that American forces could compete against German and Italian units. Samuel's stand, while tactically significant for specific engagement, had broader symbolic importance. It demonstrated that individual American soldiers with the right skills and the right circumstances could achieve results far beyond what their rank or position would suggest. Stories like Samuel's circulated through the division and the wider American forces in Tunisia, becoming examples that were used to rebuild confidence and to illustrate that defeat wasn't inevitable and that individual competence mattered. The moral complexity of Samuel's story is relatively straightforward compared to some combat narratives. He killed 33 men and wounded many more, all in the context of a defensive engagement where he was protecting a position that had tactical value and where enemy forces were actively attempting to kill him and advance against American lines. There's minimal moral ambiguity in defensive combat of this nature. Both sides understood they were engaged in warfare, where killing was the essential function. Samuel never expressed guilt about the killing, though he also never expressed pride or satisfaction. In the few instances when he discussed it later in life, his tone was matter-of-fact, describing the engagement in the same way he might describe a difficult day working cattle on the ranch, something that needed doing, that he'd done, and that was now in the past. The technological aspect of Samuel's story is worth emphasizing because it illustrates a principle that remains relevant in contemporary warfare. The Winchester Model 70 that Samuel carried was, in technical terms, an inferior weapon to modern military rifles in many respects. It was a manually operated bolt-action weapon, requiring the shooter to cycle the action after each shot. It had no advanced optics beyond a simple telescopic sight. It held only 5 rounds compared to the 8 or 10 rounds of military semi-automatic rifles. Yet in Samuel's hands, chambered in a powerful cartridge and loaded with carefully prepared ammunition, this inferior weapon achieved effects that many modern soldiers with advanced equipment struggle to replicate. The lesson isn't that old technology is better than new technology. It's that technology is only as effective as a human operator's ability to use it, and that sometimes simple tools in expert hands outperform complex tools in average hands. The institutional memory of Samuel's action faded relatively quickly after the war. His Distinguished Service Cross was a matter of record, and the basic facts of the engagement were preserved in division after-action reports. But Samuel himself became just another veteran among millions, and his story became just another anecdote from a war that produced countless examples of individual heroism. No books were written about him. No movies dramatized his stand. His name doesn't appear in popular histories of the North African campaign, and most Americans who study World War II have never heard of him. This isn't unique to Samuel. It's the normal fate of most combat actions regardless of their tactical significance or the courage they required. The official history captures the large-scale patterns, the division and corps movements, the strategic decisions, but individual actions get compressed into statistics. X casualties inflicted, Y ground held, Z time delayed. The human details, the fear and determination and skill that made those statistics possible, fade into obscurity. Yet the story of Samuel Garrett on a Tunisian hillside in February 1943 deserves to be remembered not because it was unique in the sense that no other soldier ever achieved similar results, but because it illustrates with clarity a set of principles about warfare and human performance that transcend the specific historical moment. It's a story about the disproportionate effects that skilled individuals can achieve when circumstances align, and when those individuals refuse to accept that numerical disadvantage means inevitable defeat. It's a story about the relationship between lifetime skill development and combat effectiveness, about how capabilities developed in peacetime for entirely different purposes can become militarily decisive when war demands it. It's a story about fear and function, about continuing to perform with precision when every instinct screams for flight. And it's a story about the distance between institutional recognition and individual sacrifice, about men who accomplish extraordinary things and then return to ordinary lives, carrying their experiences quietly rather than seeking or receiving the acclaim that arguably they'd earned. The Winchester rifle that killed 33 Italians returned to Montana with Samuel, where it remained for decades as a working tool on the ranch before eventually being passed to Samuel's son and then to his grandson. It was never placed in a museum, never displayed as a historical artifact, never marked as significant beyond the sentimental value any family heirloom carries. That anonymity seems appropriate somehow. The rifle was just a tool, effective because of the man who wielded it rather than because of any intrinsic quality it possessed. The man returned to the life he'd left, to work that was meaningful in different ways, to a place where the skills that had kept him alive in combat could be applied to peaceful purposes. And the story, preserved imperfectly in fading records and in the memories of fewer and fewer people who were there or who knew someone who was there, became one of millions of forgotten moments when ordinary men did extraordinary things because circumstances demanded it and because they possessed the skill and will to respond to that demand effectively. If you enjoyed this story of courage and skill, subscribe for more untold moments from history.